You go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Contemporary Issues and Zoomers. We have 8 on Zoomers too. Thank you for joining us. We are going to talk today about the book that the church is reading, Do I Stay Christian? Did anybody sit on the webinar? Join the webinar. Look, a bunch of us here did too. It was a few days ago with the author. That was nice to have a discussion between Mark and the author, Brian McLaren. So with that, I want to welcome any first timers also. If there's anybody here for the first time or anybody that's not signed up for our weekly email about what our topic is, we will just grab a piece of paper and write your email address, and we would be glad to add you onto our list. Okay, our usual announcements. Zoomers, please mute yourself in the lower left corner of your screen so we can keep the background noise down. And we are recording this for future playback. And any other announcements? Things going on. Another wonderful sermon. How does he do it every week? He is such a wordsmith, and talk today about why the church, why stay with church, what is church useful for, what draws us to church. So I want to recommend, if you haven't heard the sermon, go online and listen to that again. Any thoughts on it today? Okay.
I liked his analogy of a room. Going in a room. And I'm sure we all have them going in those rooms,
Yes,
you know.
and his dream of going into a room he'd never been in his own house. You had one of those too, Steve? Yes.
I like his reminder to love people that you don't get along.
Yes.
Yeah,
I need to be reminded that.
yeah, we can be spiritual on a high tour by ourselves, but it tests you when you have to deal with people that are hard to deal with. Yeah, so true. That was very good. And we'll talk about that today. How do you deal with a religion or a church or a history that's problematic too? What do you do with that? So good discussion. So we'll just do an informal discussion today, and I will cover the highlights of the book. You don't have to have read this book yet, because we will cover the highlights, and I have passed out in class here the table of contents for those, and he has some interesting chapter topics that he covered too, and we will go through those. Okay, any more thoughts before we start? Okay, I'm going to do share screen with a little bit of a few slides here today, so our Zoomers can watch also. We're not going to talk about the Renaissance Festival today, even though that looks like a scene from a Renaissance Festival. Or a Monty Python. So, right. That could be. Right. We are going to,
that say me.
we're going to start from the beginning here. This book has 3 sections. Part 1, why do people leave the Christian faith? And why are they not joining for the same type of reasons too? Part 2, what are the reasons to stay? And part 3, how to stay. And really the author is promoting reformation. You've heard the saying, every 500 years, religion should reform itself. And so this is another one of those examples. 63% of Americans today identify as Christian. That's down 15% in the last 10 years. Mark said in his last week's sermon, and 31% of young people today believe in the God of the Bible, lower than in past generations too. So why is that? Why are young people not seeing the Bible as relevant today? Okay. So let me jump right in. Part 1, let me ask first before we talk about some of these, for those of you that read the book, what did you think about this approach, talking about the sins of the church? Did you think that was a good way to start a discussion like this? I think some people think it was a bit harsh to talk about these things.
But it's
And,
reality.
Well, I
based.
think it makes
The reality of history.
And that's why so many people are leaving, because the church is based. on
Times we need
reality.
to be reminded.
And that's what the author says. He said, the reason I'm bringing these things up is that we don't talk about those in church today. A lot of people don't know what the Crusades were. In fact, my wife was just asking me the other day, what really were the Crusades? We've heard the term, but we don't know exactly what that meant. So,
Well, it's reality, but he doesn't make any distinction between religion and relationship.
Right.
yes, we'll get into that too.
Okay.
And we won't spend very long on each one of these sins of the church, but let's go through and mention these because he's got some good points in there too. So,
It was the Crusades trying to retake Jerusalem, wasn't it?
yes,
That's what their mission
Yes.
was.
Yeah.
yes. Let's get to that in order though. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The first thing he talks about is in the first chapter. It's got quite an unusual name for this chapter, and it is because Christianity has been vicious to its mother, the Jewish religion. And he says that page 16, that people don't know that the Jews really became a target of the early Christian church. Even the early Christian leaders like Ambrose and Augustine became revered, or they were the revered leaders who vilified the Jews and were proponents of attacks on the Jews. The Jews became the other group of choice to whom the European Christians repeatedly projected their pent-up anger and violence. There were over 200 massacres in the early years, including one in Strasbourg, France, where the entire community went after 2,000 Jews and said it was their religion that was poisoning the community, including the wells where the Christians drank. So they were attacked and killed on the spot. Later, the Protestant Reformation even perpetuated this anti-Semitism. And a lot of people don't know that Martin Luther was anti-Semitic too in his comments. He quoted Martin Luther as saying, "Their private houses must be destroyed, devastated. Let the magistrates burn their synagogues and expel them like dogs in order to expose the eternal damnation of the Jews and their lies." I never knew that. Did you all know much
No.
about their history? Of, know that Martin Luther began the Reformation and had a lot of good points in the corruption.
Should they all forget that Jesus was a Jew?
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up.
That's right.
It starts with Jewish.
Mhm. And that's a point that McLaren makes too, is how did we forget that a Jewish movement with a Jewish founder and all Jewish original followers became the focus of such an anti-Jewish approach in the early years of the church.
Did this original attack on the Jews have anything to do with Hitler's bend to go that way?
No,
No?
Well, McLaren does say that maybe that was part of the history that later influenced Hitler.
Oh,
exactly.
And so it led to and continued as a movement that continued into modern day. Yes.
You recall they, when Christ was crucified, after that, the Jews were blamed for his crucifixion
Mhm.
because of the Pharisees, et cetera. But that went on for a long period of time. The Jews became segregated into ghettos after a while because they had some beliefs that were different. And that continued all through time, all the way up through World War I and World War II. So that kind of hatred, and that looking at Jews as lesser humans than Christians. And that was
Yes.
something that Christians did all through thousands of years.
Wow.
With the easy criticism, the Jews killed Christ,
Yes,
as though it was that simple.
right.
Sometimes white Francis will say that too.
Still to this day.
Sure.
Mhm. Okay, second,
Actually, it was the Romans.
It was the
And-
Romans.
right. Okay. Second point he's making in this book, suppressing dissent. The early church, the Roman Catholic Church, has a horrible history of suppressing dissent. And that was most evident in the Galileo affair that began in 1610, culminated with the trial and condemnation of Galileo by the Roman Catholic Church in 1633. He was prosecuted for support of heliocentrism, the astronomical model that said that the Earth and the planets revolve around the sun at the center of the universe, not the other way around, as the early church believed.
Right, but my question is, why was he persecuted when Copernicus was the first one to come up with that?
Yeah, it's true. He was.
There was also a guy, Bruno, it's another person who was mentioned. who
Well-
was killed for his beliefs in a larger cosmos.
I don't
Just
like what
this
you
little
believe,
bit.
so I'll kill you.
That's been going on. forever.
Yes.
The second paragraph I have explains that a little bit from Wikipedia. It states that there were earlier scientists who proposed these things, but in 1632, Galileo published his dialogue called Two World Systems,
So,
which defended heliocentrism and was immensely popular. It was the popularity of it among the people, responding to the mounting criticism over theology that the Roman Inquisition, that started the Roman Inquisition and led to the trial in 1633. So it was really the discussion and the popularity of it that grew to such a level that the church
Challenged authority.
challenged it. He was sentenced to house arrest. He was forced to recant his theory, and was just one of the most famous examples of how the early church did not tolerate dissent when it got to the people were talking about it. They didn't mind it apparently when it was in a lesser discussing state, but when it got to the level that the common people were talking and believing, that's when they clamped down on the scientists.
That's when you lose power over people,
Exactly.
because people are reading who never used to read, but we're able to do that, and the Bible came out in German and then in other languages. And so the church hierarchy was losing power over beliefs.
that's right.
Yes, very good.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting about Constantine. I didn't know his motives or reasons
Oh,
for why he embraced the Christian religion.
He had some dream.
Yeah.
The story I was
He
told,
claimed
saw
he had
a
a
cross in the sky
Oh.
or something.
Yeah, he claimed he had a dream.
Right.
He made a political choice, but claimed it was a dream
Dream,
because he
yeah.
knew people would pay attention to that.
That's
Right.
politics.
Claimed to have a vision.
Right.
Claimed to have a vision, and he saw that Christianity was getting so popular, he had to balance the powers and acknowledge it. And so, another good point. And so this led to the Crusades. The Crusades were Roman Catholic Church sponsored wars against Muslims who had been taking power throughout the Middle East. That's my quick summary of it, including the Muslims took over Jerusalem. And so at that point, the Catholic Church said, we need to send warriors to free Jerusalem from Muslim occupation. And so that was what led to a series of wars, not only in Jerusalem, but throughout Europe against Muslims and others who didn't toe the Catholic Church line. And so this is an actual photograph from that time in 1500.
Is it on your phone? Did you?
You're blanked out.
What they wore and came down today to the
Well, we
Renaissance.
think that's stuff like that. So,
Stay Christian, it's that book by
Yeah, I
McLaren.
know. Why are they doing?
Somebody have a question on Zoom? Okay, that's all right. And the author here says, it's interesting to note that when Muhammad testified in 613 that he had received a revelation from God and had insights about Abraham, Mary, and Jesus, Christians could have welcomed him as a brother into a respectful dialogue. But as history shows, Muslims and Christians entered into this series of wars. The Christian West saw the growing Islamic empire as a threat, and Pope Urban launched the first crusade against Islam. The rivalry between the two largest religions continues today and was most recently shown in September 2001, when the coals of Christian Islamophobia that had been quietly smoldering came to life again, of course, in the attack on the World Trade Center. The reality of the abiding Christian crusader mentality became clear and revived again at that time. Christians today in the extreme sects continue the crusader mentality, seeing their neighbors as dangerous opponents in a holy conflict, and still believe you either convert and be one of us, or you're on the other side.
So you can extend that philosophy to say, even within the religions, Islam broken into the two major sects. And then, of course, within Christianity, there's Protestant versus Catholic and other divisions. Even within the Baptist church, it's practically internal warfare.
Even in the Methodist church.
Yeah. Yes. So exactly, yeah.
So it makes the whole lesson that we had today from John.
Yes.
Yes.
Makes the sermon very relevant.
Very gradually accepted and little done in its path.
Absolutely. He goes on to mention, of course, the slavery issue and how so many early Christians were in the slave business and saw no conflict of interest between engaging in slavery and owning slaves and their Bible, which said in parts, if you take it literally, slaves obey your masters and do not question authority. So that's another interesting point in the book. Yeah, he quotes also Frederick Douglass, the early Black slave opponent, as saying, the church of this country is not only indifferent to the wrongs of the slave, it actually takes sides with the oppressor. It's shamelessly given sanction of religion and Bible to the whole slavery system. When I look at that, I say welcome atheism in preference to a gospel interpretation that thinks slavery is all right. They strip the love of God from its beauty and they leave this horrible system in place. So 600 years of slavery discussed also.
It was hard to turn away from that free labor.
From the free labor, that's right, that's right. So,
Motive for keeping it around.
okay. Another chapter in here was what McLaren called the yes men of the early Christian and even modern Christian religion too. He said our humans are wired in our brains to be social creatures, herd animals, and to protect our own tribe. This has led to yes men in the early church and in today, doing whatever is necessary to protect their tribe and the systems that are in place. This wiring of our brains keeps us vigilant for any sign of social rejection or disapproval. Makes us crave acceptance of our companies, and our churches, and our tribes, and not pressed to change anything about the way business is done. A large number, this has resulted in a large number of what I call Christian company men who have perpetuated the oppressive systems that have been in place. Loyalty becomes their primary qualification, not love of God, not interest in justice. But fellow company men promote them and have covered up for the corruption that company men have done. He does talk about the Catholic Church and the pedophilia priest, covering up of the priest, and how that has turned off a lot of people, especially a lot of young people that think.
This is not a good line of discussion. We might have the group all giving up, just saying no to Christianity. Has been very bad history.
Yes, yes. But interesting that McLaren points out, it's not just in Catholicism, it's been in all of the denominations. Too. And, yeah, it's easier to move these problems along via don't rock the boat, be a yes person.
Well, Romans 3:23 is pretty clear.
What that say?
For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God.
Well, I think too that some people. It's easy to be yes people into a religion. I think it's easier to be a yes person to a religion, but just to go in and have them say, this is how it is, this is what you do, and this is how you act, and this is what you don't do. And if you don't or do all these things, then you are who we are.
Cast.
And I just think that it's easy to be yes people sometimes.
That's how
you know?
national socialism started.
Mm.
It's easier to get along.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
it certainly carries over into politics, loyalty to a party or a political figure. We've seen a few examples of that.
Yeah.
The real frightening thing is with these decreased numbers is that we may be looking at the end of the move of Christianity in its real sense. And if the young people keep responding,
Mhm.
Well, we just lose a young generation.
each young generation, we're gonna shrink.
Is that a bad thing?
If it's not the real thing, no, it's not a bad thing. But I think when you're trying to do, if you're following the Romans scripture that we had this morning, then I think there is something to say there.
Mhm. Absolutely.
We went to a
And we'll
class.
get on to that. Go ahead.
We went to a class one time, and it was a team leader. And he said, you're not giving God enough credit if you think that he doesn't know how to reach each generation. It's not our way, but it's his way, and he can do it, and he will do it, you know? So if we don't see it happening the way we think it ought to happen, that means maybe the way it happened for us isn't a good way anymore. You know, so I've always thought about that. I thought, don't judge how God's trying to reach young people, because it's different than how he reached us. So that always helped me.
And after Columbine, our pastor in Littleton said that God uses tragedy to force people to make up their minds up about God.
Mhm.
Either they turn away in bitterness or they embrace him and the truth.
Mhm.
The next chapter is about toxic theology, and this is the last section we'll do on this one, but McLaren says that Christianity is stuck. He says, I see Christianity as a huge ship capable of amazing voyages. It has tall masts and wide sails, a powerful ship, but it's going nowhere because its anchor is so heavy and its crew cannot pull it up. For most Christians I encounter today, beliefs are simply what Christianity is. I point out that in its early years, Christianity was really a way of life, not a set of beliefs. But people will protest that even yet today, that say that beliefs are priority. If I point out that the earliest Christians were widely divergent in their beliefs, which Mark talked about today in his sermon, people are surprised and doubtful. They want to hang on to thinking that beliefs are the primary part of being a Christian. Imagine if scientists stopped being curious, stopped hypothesizing and designing experiments, and just hung on to their views of the past. That's what religion is doing today. In this light, imagine a Christianity that deploys practitioners even today that tell you to just hang on to your beliefs that you've always had. These disciples would be defined by an ongoing quest of trying to protect the church. Now, in contrast, imagine a Christianity that sends out people to promote exploration, to not try to police beliefs, but to try to explore and see where we can go in the future. Thought that was a good summary.
Did he say anything about practices? It's practices that's what are important, not beliefs.
Well, didn't
He does
Paul
go into
say, I think in one of the epistles or whatever, or maybe it was in the New Testament, he said, that other people would look at the early Christians, because maybe we're gonna go back to being like early Christians were in our development, and they used to say, look at those Christians, look how they love one another. And that, you know, and I'm thinking, maybe we're gonna go back, maybe the development of Christianity means behavior over other kinds of things, and then how you treat people.
Well, that's what the rest of the book is about. How do we do this? How do we reform
That was-
and evolve too?
Yeah.
I wanted to point out this interesting graphic that I just found online. Kind of gives the impression that toxic theology is in every one of the religions. Of course it is, starting with Christianity on the left, Islam, and then the Star of David in the middle. I'm not sure what the I is, but and that brings up the point of all of these are trying to reform in some way or have tried to reform. Muslims today, the moderate Muslims are trying, there's growing numbers of them that are trying to reform and bring Islam into the 21st century. And how do they do that? A lot of them are talking about that. Judaism has the whole reform category of Judaism. There is separated into sections as Christianity is. That was good. What do you think about the concept of Islam reforming, going through Reformation?
Yeah, look what's happening in Iran.
Iran with the women protesting and for rights, but then how do they do that?
Not successful
How
yet.
do they move forward?
It's put their lives on the line.
They do put their
Yes.
lives on.
Yes, they are. But they're doing the same thing we are. They're trying to find spokespeople and a clear message on how to reform and how to spread that message throughout the world to their religion. Yes, Carol.
Yeah, I work with an RN who's Muslim. And I found out it's of course, a male dominated religion. He had an arranged marriage. Based, I guess, one Muslim family marrying into, and her family's wealthy. She cannot read or write. That's what shocked me. In today's society. She stays home. She has born 4 children. But in today's society, it was shocking. In my experience.
Mhm.
How does one cope with that?
He talks,
Got a question?
sure. Oh, questions, Linda? See your hands up, please go ahead.
What struck me about the whole first section was that every single one of those, we could draw contemporary correlations. And that, every single one of those gives some people an option for getting out.
Yes, and they still continue today because human nature is the same. We're always going to have people that are violent and corrupt. And but thank goodness it's not at the level that it was during the Crusades. The world is less violent overall.
I don't know.
I
That's questionable, Steve.
Don't you think, Ron, that we've talked about this? Historians say today there are fewer wars. There is overall less violence in the world than there was during the Middle Ages, for
It's
instance.
true, it's true.
So maybe we
We
are.
don't, I get that feeling from listening to national news. If you look at the global averages, the global morality is going up.
We were
Love to
listening,
Believe that. I'm looking at handguns and the shootings that are going on in this country every day. I don't have it.
Okay.
we were listening to a Ken Burns thing on World War II. And one of the commentators at the end said, as long as men are alive, there will be difficulties, that evil abounds. And this was back in World War
Did he mean men or did he mean humanity, all men and women?
What was that quote?
Humanity.
Humanity.
Okay. So it wasn't just limited to bad guys like Ron and I.
Humanity. It's an excellent series, but you know.
Ron's over there, saying, what a mess.
As long as there's testosterone. we'll be fine.
Don't book me in there.
Yeah.
Carol, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we have an economic war. Going on. We don't have actual warfare so much as we have, a desire by China to destroy us economically.
Mhm.
Why have a war when you can attempt to destroy a country economically with a bloodless war?
But you could send over balloons.
Different types of.
That's just what we see.
Right,
TikTok.
yeah.
Yeah.
Walmart, Amazon, I mean, all your products come from China.
It's all on TikTok nowadays.
Yes,
We try to, that's the world labor market.
Yeah.
through interdependent. The next section, chapter, he talks about evolution. Why don't we see and accept that religion is evolving? He says, McLaren says, why can't we Christians admit, like everything else in the universe, our religion is actually unavoidably changing for the better or worse as time goes on? We can't allow our leaders' job descriptions to stay as belief police, trying to keep us in a lane and police our beliefs. Why can't we admit that we are stuck in an old model of the religion universe? Why are we more loyal to the heavy anchor than to our call to adventure to go into the future? We must be asking what we can become. If we are to get unstuck and back on the path of maturing as a religion, and doing our part to help our species mature, we must open our minds to the possibilities. Christianity can be one of those religions. It's still in its infancy state. It's only 2,000 years old compared to other religions. And we must be open to the Holy Spirit leading us forward into what it can be. And on page 96, he points out that's exactly what Jesus did in his time. Jesus, of course, saw the possibilities and the interpretations for Judaism at that time. He stayed, and he stayed out loud. It was worth it to him to stay and try to reform the society at that time. Was he a fool to stay in the fray with the religious company men of his day, naming their corruption and toxicity? He called them broods of vipers. Would he have been wiser to leave quietly and go to India and become a Hindu? Or to China and become a Buddhist? Was he a fool to think that the tiny handful of people who only understood his message were enough? And did he see some faint glimmer of what could be coming later on if he continued and spoke out? His decision was to stay and try to reform Judaism at the time. What do you think of that concept?
Well, those were his people. Those were God's special people.
Hmm?
They weren't the people living in India or China or some other
Right.
place. I think that in his initial, he told disciples several times, we don't let the crumbs fall for the other. We're here to feed Israel.
Mhm.
And of course, then somebody else pointed out, but even
Dogs.
the dogs eat the crumbs, you know.
Table from the master's table.
Yeah.
Eric, tell us about your point that you felt about in the book about relationship was not focused on enough.
Oh, I think he speculates a lot. And of course, in science, there's two kinds of evidence. There's qualitative and quantitative. And a lot of what he's saying is qualitative without too much statistics, except for the statistics where he talks about how white evangelical and Catholicism, their numbers are dropping, and he gave the statistics for that. But for the most part, it was a lot of speculation and assumptions, but there's no distinction between, okay, this is religion, but what about relationship? Christ. And that triggers my mind. It makes me think of that scary passage in Matthew 7, beginning at verse 21, where people, Jesus says, there's gonna be many that'll say, Lord, Lord, look what we did. In your, we prophesied in your name, we did these miracles in your name, and he's gonna say, depart from me, for I never knew you. So there's that relationship aspect. Even somebody who's got the power to preach and do these miracles, do great things without the relationship. He's gonna say, depart from me, for I never knew you. Just go, go away. So that's the relational aspect, I think, that he skips over or chooses not to mention.
Let's not focus so much on that. His next chapter talks about in the Reformation that he advocates that we really need to talk more about not interpreting the Bible literally. And McLaren says, in his opinion, that that's where a lot of the harm has come from in the Christian church. This has shaped the conservative church so much that they take literally what is talked about in the Bible and ignore the history and the context. He kind of sums this up on page 115, and he says that there is a historical development of stories. And we have to acknowledge that that took place even in the Bible and with Jesus' story. He says the first step is that someone like Jesus lives an extraordinary life, and that people want to start to tell stories about that person. Second, the stories are orally passed on. Third, these stories are changed due to faulty memory, vivid imaginations, and sometimes the intentional dramatization by storytellers. Fourth, different versions of the original story spread, as is natural when oral stories are done and have not been written down. And this even shows up in the Gospels when there are differences in the stories in the Gospels. Fifth, when people are confronted with various versions, they tend to choose the version that best fits their feelings and desires for the hero. So this leads to even more exaggeration and telling of the story in different ways. And finally, one or more of the stories is written down when written language comes into view, and then the stories get even changed as translations come about, and the translators do the best they can, but still cannot find the exact representation of the story as it began in the beginning.
Steve, do we, in this church, do we teach the youth? I was taught that many years ago, that it's just a book of stories.
That the Bible is?
Yes, it's not something that's God given, or it's just story. You just look at it.
Inspired by, but not written by God.
Well, that's a good question. Does anybody know what we teach
But
here
what do
at
we
St.
teach
Andrew?
here? Because wouldn't it be important to get those kids in maybe 6th or 7th grade? Or when they get a Bible, I don't know, when do they get a Bible?
Fifth grade.
Third grade. I would like to ask someone in our church what their approach
That's
is.
a good question. We should have Cindy Click as a guest
Yeah.
sometime
Oh,
here
yes.
that leads, and ask her those kind of questions.
Especially in light of what we're doing.
Yeah,
Okay.
Carol.
Why is it many of our young people believe in nothing? Except maybe technology. Technology has entered, technology is their God. It solves all their problems.
I think we need to be careful not to underestimate our youth. I think it's really easy to say, oh, what do they know? Oh, they're inexperienced. Oh. But just having worked with them for so many years, we are in good hands. It's going to be different than just like what you said, Vicki. It's going to be different for our future generations. But there are our youth care. They just care in a different way than we do. I can speak our own children were raised. We went to church every Sunday. They heard all the stories. We did all the rituals. And when they went to college, they left the church. And have not come back.
But they left the church, but I bet they're Christian acting.
Christian acting would be good.
They
make them
they are good, decent human beings and care about other people.
Sounds like they're more spiritual than religious.
Well,
Yeah,
They just don't need to have the word Christian. They believe so.
actually, one of our daughters actually rejects the church. It isn't just that she rejects the church because the church has been hurtful.
Oh, yeah.
And when you feel like an institution has been hurtful to you and people that you care about, you feel like they are speaking one way but behaving another, and it's a betrayal. So she's a wonderful human being and decent, but has been betrayed by the church, by everything she was taught. The church doesn't behave that way towards her. So I can see that that can be one reason why some people leave the church. Anyway, I got off on a tangent. I just want us to be careful not to say, oh, young people today,
Yeah.
they don't know anything and they're gonna be the ruin of it, because I think we're in good hands.
There, thank you. Question, yes.
I think young people are searching, just as many adults are searching. They're searching their pathway to God. And it may include a church, and very often it does not, because they like flexibility and they like to look at different things. So I think that's part of the development of human beings, actually, and their thought processes. That they are searching and looking for other things in other ways. And there are many pathways to God. It doesn't have to be the Christian church.
One thing that I think we forget in Christianity is that when Jesus left, he told us he was going to prepare a place for us, but that he left us with the Holy Spirit. That was to give us the power to go out and be disciples. Well, I think that that's where the spiritual thing comes in and where the relationship things comes in, because kids today may not know what it is that they feel, but it is that drawing that he promised us he would lead it, and I just think we make it difficult, and it's really not, we do make it difficult, I think.
And God can reject our rejection.
Yeah.
Another part in his book is, he says, don't put God in a box. That,
Yeah.
that is what the church, major sin that the church has done, is try to provide all the answers and condition us to see God in one way. And if your God's big enough, we won't fit in a box. Yep. Okay, Zoomers, I want to acknowledge you and ask if you've got any thoughts. Jump on in here, please, and give thoughts, because we're going to talk last 15 minutes about what a reformation should look like. He doesn't in this book give lots of details, because nobody knows what the next reformation should look like, except we would like for it to be a progressive, of course, because we are the progressive church, and an opening up and a more open-minded type of religion, but we don't know what faith exactly that will take. Go ahead, anybody? He does talk about in the book that there are things we should look at about how to do that. For example, we should
Oh, you mean on page 195?
I was just thinking where that was.
Review the prayers, look at the length and structure of our services.
Yes, thanks, Carol. He has several specific suggestions for things to do that churches can do today in our individual churches. Diversify the way we refer to the divine. For example, in the webinar, he talked about let's write our own prayers and creeds. If your church thinks that the creeds are outdated and use language that's outdated, write your own creeds. and see if those reflect how you think God is today. Look at the length and structure of your services, see if there are missing elements. Determine which songs and hymn lyrics are problematic today and don't reflect what you believe in your church. Which there are some, as Mark Zwilling told us last week, that Justin, our band leader, will not sing certain songs and lead us in certain songs that don't reflect our theological beliefs today. And so, can anybody think of those onward Christian soldiers? Militarism might be viewed that way. Mhm.
That's to put your picture away.
Washed in the blood.
He also suggests determine if you want shorter sermons followed by a dialogue, or whether sermons should be replaced entirely, sometimes with a conversation instead of traditional sermon and liturgy. Review the liturgies so that the meanings we intend are clear. We're not leaving people misunderstanding. Review our foundational documents and creeds, and do the same with your website. Decide what elements should be replaced. And remember, we won't get it right the first time. We are embarking on a long-term
Yeah.
growth process of reformation. Even critics and opponents will be opposed today, of course, as they were in ages past. So we will need to learn how to win trust of many groups and accept that our progress may be very slow. Another thing I've heard about too, and we're talking about Reformation, it will take some inciting incident, as it did with Luther tacking the 95 Theses and was called to the door at the right time, and starting some kind of cultural event at that time, or Martin Luther King coming forward as the leader in the Black movement. So what would that take for a progressive church movement
Well, World
to
War.
happen? A World War, or the collapse of the conservative church, if that happens. Yeah, what do you think about that? Do you think do we need a Protestant Pope that would be a speaker? Or
No.
one person?
Because one, exactly, just like we said, so many Methodists are so different and.
Yeah, nobody.
I can't speak for all of us,
Yeah.
except for.
I've seen some non-religious named organizations effectively acting like progressive Christianity should be. A good example, I was down in the Capitol a good 4 years ago visiting one day. And all the Mothers Demand Action group were there. And there were several hundred of them. And they came in all shapes and sizes and ages and races. And I'm sure they represented every religion, but they all had one accord. It was to encourage the legislature to find ways to reduce gun violence. And yeah, and there was gun violence, reduce gun violence, find ways to do it.
How did that work?
So it didn't have a religious name to it, but yeah, but it certainly was, in my view, it was advancing humanity.
What about
That's what-
events? What about event like the football player that died on the, yeah, or heart
Almost
stopped,
died.
right? That seemed to really rally people, temporarily. But,
So wait, do we need somebody to sacrifice themselves?
well, it's interesting that when something like that happened, people just felt called to pray, or to something, some higher power because they had no control over what was going on at that time. It's just interesting how quickly it happened, but how quickly it, goes away,
I
Yeah,
think
what-
it'll take somebody or some event where people realize they don't have control.
yeah.
And
9/11.
so, what?
9/11 and
Yeah.
COVID.
Yeah, and people are gonna say, Okay, where is the control? They're gonna look up. At least that's my personal opinion.
It's back to that tragedy comment I made about the pastor.
Of course, some people speculated after, excuse me, January 6th riot at the Capitol, that would be a inciting event that would help reform democracy, the American political system, but it didn't end up being that way. So what does it take?
Something bigger.
What would it take? Something
Economy.
even bigger than that?
Something bigger
The
than
collapse of the economy or something?
Or with China.
McLaren says on page 175, I'm not sure exactly what it will take, and nobody knows what it will take to reform Christianity. He says, but I choose to stay because I love the religion's founder and the message we have. But we will be still a minority movement within Christianity to reform it for some time. That's why we also need parallel movements in Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, and other faiths to help, because we are all in this together to try and save our world.
Yes.
What does this mean for us going forward? We don't know, but we are trying to find out.
maybe an attack from the universe, Martians or something.
Yeah, that would be something to get us all together. Yeah, unified event.
Humanity,
So,
including Buddhism, Hinduism, Muslims, Christians, all trying to get along rather than fight each other, because we're human beings. Because we have the human beings are basically, their needs are the same. They just express it differently.
it's interesting because I heard a story on PBS NewsHour, I think it was, about water and how speculators from New York City are buying up land on the western slope. That water is going to become the new oil.
Yes.
It's so it's right now that water rights along the Colorado River are being bought up by speculators in New York because they don't want the land. They want the water rights.
In our last 5 minutes, the last chapter, in actually appendix, he has a few pages on, do I stay in my denomination? This is a parallel question. People are asking that too. Those that are staying in Christianity often change their denomination, like a lot of us in this room have. And he says, we offer the same kind of advice. Should you stay and try to improve the denomination you're in, like Jimmy Carter with the Baptist? Jimmy stayed and spoke out against the anti-women approach of the Baptist. And so he says, have conversations within your churches about this too. Try to stay and reform your denomination rather than leaving it and leaving it in the shape that it is. What do you think of that?
The Lutherans are struggling to try to keep the people from leaving because there's so many people in that church. They're wrestling with why are people,
Lutherans are?
Yeah.
Mhm.
especially in Missouri Synod.
And of course, now we've got the split going on in Methodism. 20% roughly, they say, of the churches are leaving and going to the new conservative. Whatever they call it,
Wesley, what is?
Global Methodist Church.
Only 20%.
Yeah, it's only about 20.
Really?
That's the figure I've read. That's correct.
Now, is that a more conservative approach?
Yes.
Does
Yeah,
that
the
include all the African people?
So with only 20%, how are they get away with global?
Right.
They've got people around, that 25% includes people around the world too. Let me take Jim and then Helen.
I wish we had a national Protestant spokesman. A national spokesman for Protestant, we used to have.
A Protestant Pope? There we go.
I can't think of the person's name, but we used to have some Protestant who was a national spokesman.
Billy Graham?
Gary Falwell. Before Billy Graham. The truth was kind of that.
Billy something.
I'm with you. Helen,
Does anyone here know the difference between Parker United Methodist and our church? Recently, I just come upon several who are trying our church. And this morning, a very strong couple, Kelly and Kurt, in the meeting of folks, I said, "Hi, you're new, aren't you?" And she said, "It's our very first Sunday." So of course, I took her to the Cafe Connect, but just a lovely couple, really. And she said, "Yes, we were at Parker United Methodist for, I believe it was 24 years."
fine.
And she asked if we knew the Reverend, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten her name, that's now the head of the senior group here. She knew them well and just had nothing but nicest things to say about Parker and the people there. But it's interesting to me that we're getting quite a few from Parker.
From over, okay, well, that's a whole nother thing. You not only stay in your denomination, do you change church within your
Right.
denomination? Yeah. At every level, people ask themselves these questions. Yeah, very good. Okay, any final thoughts? We're out of time. Did you like this book? Those that have read it, was it thoughtful? Or it didn't really give us a final answer? How do you reform Christianity? What's the future of progressive Christianity going to be? But, you know, our pastors have said we're positioned well for the future, we think, because young people are more progressive. They don't take the Bible literally, they ask questions, and so we think that St. Andrew is well positioned for the future to welcome those kind of people. But who knows? We shall see. Zoomers, any final thought? Nobody's got the answer? We'll have to come up with it all together. Thanks, everybody. Good discussion today. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.